Chapter 3 is titled Federalism, and it's really outlining the relationship between the federal government and the member state governments of the United States. So, really, that's the basic definition of federalism. In the Federalist Papers, you have major contributors in James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and a little more minor of a contributor, John Jay, because he got sick in the middle of the ratification debates and couldn't contribute quite as much as Madison and Hamilton. But they all write pro-Constitution editorials in newspapers under the pen name Publius. And there are some respondents who also write the anti-federalist papers, tend to be less known, but some really well-known people are New York Supreme Court Justice Robert Yates, under the pen name Brutus, U.S. Senator from Virginia Richard Henry Lee, under the pen name of the Federal Farmer, and New York Governor George Clinton, under the pen name of Cato. So you have two sides to the ratification debates. The Anti-Federalists were very suspicious of federal power and preferred the Articles of Confederation and the state power that is outlined in they. You have enumerated, reserved, and concurrent powers. A few really key terms to know. And enumerated powers are those that are specifically listed for the federal government. Reserved powers are set aside for the states. Reserved powers, they are set aside, they are saved for the states, and that is outlined in the 9th and 10th Amendments. And then concurrent powers are powers that are shared. Both the federal and state governments, for example, can levy taxes on things. This term that we have discussed numerous times now in this course, tyranny of the majority. Decisions made by a majority are often considered tyrannical to a minority. A good example of this, as you can see on the right, there was a vote in the state of California a number of years ago called Proposition 8. Should people be denied a marriage license if you are a same-sex couple? If you voted yes, it said keep marriage traditional between a man and a woman, do not allow same-sex marriage. Voting no said no, that's wrong, anybody should be able to apply for a marriage license. This was, of course, prior to the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell v. Hodges, but in the state of California, for a window of time, that proposition passed. So a majority voted yes, and that was how, for a window of time anyway, the state of California would not issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. That, of course, changed upon the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell v. Hodges. States' rights. This is the idea that states could resist increasing power in the federal government. It is used vehemently to defend the system of slavery in the South prior to the fighting of the Civil War. It is also used to defend the Jim Crow system of segregation throughout Reconstruction and well into the 1900s, right up through the passing of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. You can see one of my favorite historical photos. I think it speaks volumes. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 said that it was okay to segregate facilities. They could be separate as long as they were equal. Well, this photo shows that very obviously things were not kept equal. Here is the main water source to these two fountains. The white fountain, obviously the pipe goes in this direction, black fountain in this direction. You can see this fountain, and although the photo is in black and white, you can see the discoloration that shows the complete lack of cleaning of this fountain. Whereas you can see just how shiny and pristine looking that this fountain is. It also has an electrical source, which leads one to believe that it is cooled, that there is water cooling going on in this. And so very obviously this is unequal. Not until 1954, with Brown versus Board of Education, was it declared that public facilities being segregated was unconstitutional. It is even longer before the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus U.S. decision said that even private businesses could not segregate, could not discriminate. And that was not until 1967, I believe. Now, bad things have definitely been used, or been defended, I should say, using the principle of states' rights. But is it a good thing to allow the federal government more and more power that they have no enumerated power via the Constitution to possess? And what may come if we allow a federal government that is allowed more and more and more power? And I have a series of photos here on the bottom of dystopian things like the Hunger Games, Fahrenheit 451, 1984. These are famous dystopian novels. You can see here the Big Brother is Watching You poster, which is from 1984. You can also see photos of both President Bush and President Obama all the way to the right, both of whom were accused throughout their presidencies of abusing their power in some way, shape, or form. Now, one of the biggest expansions of government power in the history of the United States is the New Deal. It is more often evaluated by its intentions and its some handful of successes. It is rarely evaluated based on its constitutionality, and how many things in the New Deal were direct violations of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and the Supreme Court even said so. Things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which fixed prices on farm goods, the National Recovery Administration, which gave executive authority over legislative powers. And lastly, the Glass-Steagall Act, which created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which essentially is a guaranteed bailout to the banking industry all the time. These are all things that the Supreme Court questioned at the time, yet continued on, happened anyway, and no one really questioned. Bank bailouts should sound rather familiar in recent history here in the United States. The financial crisis of 2007 and 8 took the better part of a decade to climb out of. And you can see that bailouts of things like the banks, or in this case what's depicted here, the auto industry, via things like subsidies and via things like hourly wages that are completely out of line with average hourly wages in other segments of the economy, that United Auto Workers, would obviously be more than happy to have more power in the federal government, because the federal government is doing everything they can to subsidize them and then allow them to turn around and pay these extremely high wages to their workers. Not saying that's a bad thing, but it's government subsidized, which leads to lots of government expenses. And who would do something seemingly so dumb? Well, during the presidency of George W. Bush, he signed into law something known as Medicare Part D, which is a prescription drug benefit for senior citizens, with no real plan to pay for it. And then there were lots of things throughout the financial crisis and the attempted recovery from it that would lead President Obama to say that things had been Bush's fault, but there were many decisions, poor financial decisions, made by both of these presidents. And one of my favorite politicians in all of history is a guy by the name of Ron Paul, who, above and beyond anything else, preached fiscal responsibility. government spending not exceeding what we take in revenue. And so he was a fellow that, although he was a Republican congressman from Texas, and regularly made Democrats mad, he also made a lot of Republicans within his own party mad with some of the things that he would say. So that's why I really liked him, is he was a pretty independent thinker, and didn't really always do what his party thought he should do. Here's a couple of concepts. We talked about this in class. Dual federalism versus cooperative federalism. And dual federalism is very defined roles. And that is depicted by this layer cake. Okay? The national government had its responsibilities, the state government has its responsibilities, and the cooperative federalism is more depicted by this layer cake, and how the federal and state governments cooperated on things. And this really changed right around the time of the New Deal and the Great Depression, and they coordinated their funding accordingly so that they would be able to better fund some of their priorities that they shared. Then you have regulated federalism. This is a form of federalism in which Congress imposes legislation, requires states and localities to meet particular national standards, but they often result in what's called an unfunded mandate. A law passed by the federal government, it requires things, but it doesn't provide any funds. Then you have this term devolution. This is sending responsibility for a program from one level of government to another. And a good example of this would be something like Medicare or Medicaid or food stamps. These are things that were required by the federal government. They are funded by the federal government, but not always fully funded. And this is often referred to as passing the buck. So the federal government says these things that they must be done, but they rarely will actually help out by fully funding the programs that they require. Federal grants, okay, this is all part of that unfunded mandate and devolution concept, is that the federal government will essentially say to the states, here's a giant grant, here's a bunch of grant money from the federal government, you figure out things like Medicare, Medicaid. These things are initially paid for by federal grants, but because of increasing cost, state dollars are then required to back up these programs. This is classic devolution. Here's just a political cartoon from the midst of the financial crisis, in which President Obama and all of the federal government spending that was going on during the financial crisis, and he is going to the U.S. Treasury, which is represented by this emaciated cow, and here he comes with all these buckets: bailouts for the auto industry, bailouts for the banking industry, bailouts for the housing industry, bailouts for the insurance industry. Here's AIG, a major corporation that got a big bailout, and the poor U.S. Treasury is looking at him like, hey, I've got nothing left to give. Redistributive programs, first of all, go back and define what is redistribution of wealth. The goal here is to essentially, like Robin Hood, you take from the rich and you give to the poor. This is done through taxing and spending. So wealthier people pay more in taxes to then aid the poor. The translation, how to make this easy to understand. A progressive income tax, which means the more you make, it's almost like a staircase. The more you make, the higher your rate in income taxes becomes, and the monies are then redistributed to lower classes via social programming, entitlement programs. Some good examples would be Medicare and Medicaid, welfare, unemployment, food stamps. These are all programs that are forms of redistribution of wealth. How is this paid for? Well, of course, you have in 1913 the creation of the graduated income tax under the leadership of Woodrow Wilson. This would be one of the big reasons why I name Woodrow Wilson as my least favorite president. And the real message in 1913 is, hey, it's not so bad, because if you look at this, in 1913 dollars, if you made up to $20,000, which in 2010 adjusted for inflation dollars is over $440,000, you only paid 1% in income taxes because there were no additional income taxes charged of you. The further down this goes, okay, you get all the way up to the seventh income bracket, over $500,000, which is a 2010 equivalent of a little over $11 million. You obviously pay the normal rate, which is the same for everyone in this category, but then graduating all the way up to a 6% rate, that the seventh category paid a 7% tax rate. Now, if that was still true, things would be glorious. Mr. Baker, who does definitely not make $11 million or more, and that this is adjusted for inflation in 10 years ago dollars, that I would love to pay 7% income taxes. I pay significantly more than that. And so it's not so bad that I mentioned before. This was the message from the federal government. Hey, it's not so bad. The rates aren't that bad. Well, when you take that it's not so bad and run with it, by 1918, at the end of World War I, the top tax rate went from 7% to 77%. That's an 1,100% increase in taxes. The top rate from 1951 to 1964, this 13-year period, the top tax rate was 91%. This is a 118% increase on the 1918 rate, and a 1,300% increase on the original 1913 rates. If you know of the children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, the next thing is he's going to want a glass of milk. So this analogy really means don't feed the beast. If you give the government 7%, they're going to want 77% and then 91%. And even if no one is intending for those trends to take place, they will undoubtedly take place anyway. In 2012 and 13, some misleading statements were made when President Obama said he was going to see to it that only millionaires and billionaires would be affected by tax increases, when in this time period you saw people even in the lowest tax brackets saw their taxes go up. Some people in the middle saw them stay either the same or only up a few percentage points, and then the top tax bracket went up 4.6%. So actually the largest percentage anyway increase in taxes was on those making the least amount of money. During President Obama's presidency, his signature piece of legislation, meaning what he would refer to as his crowning achievement, is the Affordable Care Act. This, first and foremost, requires that all Americans have health insurance. And there's a penalty clause when you file your taxes if you do not have proof of having health insurance. If you don't get it provided through your employer, you must purchase it in the private marketplace. And the other thing that this required was public options funded by the federal and state governments. This also forbid companies from rejecting customers based on pre-existing conditions. Now, like a lot of political decisions, there are good intentions, but then often a different reality due to the unintended consequences of that decision. The intention of this was that lots more people buying insurance means more competition and in turn lower prices. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, some companies couldn't keep up with the new requirements and went out of business. So now you have fewer fewer suppliers of health insurance. And you're also flooding the market with new people that are now searching for health insurance, which is higher demand. And this is a very basic, simple economic principle that then leads to higher prices, not lower prices. You can see in a basic supply and demand chart that you have market equilibrium in the dead center of this chart. And when you increase demand while not doing much to supply, or supply actually decreasing because of fewer companies out there, that leads to higher prices, because you can see the high demand here, lower supply here, is going to lead to things being on this side of the chart, which is higher prices. If you were somehow able to drastically increase supply at the same time, you might be able to maintain equilibrium, or maybe even if you could outpace demand with supply, you could even lower prices. So the Obama administration was really not willing to negotiate the more controversial portions of the bill, and then the term Obamacare gets attached to the Affordable Care Act because of that unwillingness to negotiate. The biggest areas of contention, of course, are the individual mandate, making everyone have health care. The suggested solution, of course, to this is to dissolve the mandate, let people decide for themselves whether they can afford private health care. And then, of course, the healthcare exchanges. These were created by the federal and state governments to give people a single place to go to find the best deal they could on healthcare. The suggested solution is to dissolve the exchange as it exists and replace it with something else. The biggest stumbling block here for the opponents to the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare, is that the replace it piece, there are few very specific plans that have been proposed as a replacement. So people are very standoffish, very suspicious of doing away with something without a viable alternative. Now, one very specific suggestion that has been thrown out there is to allow insurance companies to sell their health insurance the same way they sell life insurance or auto insurance, and sell it across state lines. This would create significantly more competition in the market. As it stands right now, you cannot do this, which some believe has caused many of the problems with rising prices. This is the end of the Chapter 3 lecture on federalism. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out to me, and I will see you in class.